I'm very interested in your research about the dietary guidelines, and I think that would be really valuable to discuss. So, you know, the listeners are probably not all that well versed in research methodology, and, you know, they won't know the difference between a, you know, epidemiology study and a, you know, like a random control trial. So would you just break that down a little bit in layman's terms so that they can understand? Sometimes when they read the headlines in the papers about, you know, we're on a real plant-based thing in New Zealand at the moment. And so they can sort of get a bit of an understanding about what they should be looking for, especially things about relative risk and, you know, things like that.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'll start with my PhD because this is one that has affected everyone, and I don't think everybody realises this. So what I did with my PhD was to go back and look at the 2 dietary fat guidelines that were introduced. And they were introduced first in the US in 1977, which is why the dietary guidelines that come out of America are so important to all of us, because a lot of the world then just pick up those guidelines and follow them. So in 1977, the US said you should not have any more than 30% of your daily calorie intake in the form of fat, and you shouldn't have more than 10% in the form of saturated fat, which is just one of 3 dietary fats that are always found in real foods. And those guidelines were then picked up by the UK in 1983, and then the rest of the world has followed suit. Now, one of the most important things to realize straight away, if you think of a pie diagram, there are only 3 macronutrients that we eat, and we know them as carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Now, I'll give you a nutritional fact. It is just a fact. Protein tends to be about 15% of any natural diet. And surprisingly, that doesn't really matter whether it's a plant-based diet or an animal-based diet. If you look globally across the world, we tend to consume about 15% of our intake in the form of carbohydrate. So picture that pie, and you've got the 15% taken out in protein. You'll notice that the minute you put a limit on fat of 30%, you have then said that 55% of that pie is going to be carbohydrate. So the reason that those dietary fat guidelines are so important is that the minute you set a limit on fat, you have automatically prescribed a high carbohydrate diet. And that is really, really important to remember, because people don't know specifically, why are we told to eat so much carbohydrate? We didn't know that eating a high level of carbohydrate was healthy. We didn't even know that it was safe at the time that we introduced those guidelines. It was just a consequence of setting a guideline of 30%. And people need to realize that. So what I did is something then called systematic review. And it might sound a bit glamorous. It's not at all. What it basically means is you look at all the evidence. Because what you'll quite often find is if somebody says, oh, look at the PREDIMED study, it shows that olive oil and nuts are really good for you. That's cherry picking. That's taking one study to prove the point that you want to make. That's not science, that's cherry picking. So systematic review says, right, we go and look at the academic databases, and we look at absolutely all the evidence, whether we like it or not. We go in with no confirmation bias, and we look and see what it says to us. And then there's a tool that we've had since about 1976. We use it a lot nowadays, called meta-analysis. And all that is a statistical technique for taking the data from all the studies that you find and pooling it together. So you're not just looking at that one PREDIMED study, you're looking at that PREDIMED study with all the other studies that looked at olive oil or nuts or dietary fat or whatever your research question is. So in my PhD, I said, okay, so there's 2 types of evidence, basically. There's the epidemiological study, and another word for that is just a population study. And what that might be, it might be, so you take the Framingham study, for example, in Massachusetts. That was a population study. So they went to this little town, which is about 20 miles west of Boston in the US. And they said, we would like to study you over many years. Are you up for this? And the townspeople said yes. A lot of them opted in, about 5,200 in the original review. And so they went for blood tests, and they had their weight checked and their blood pressure checked and their age and their sex and their cholesterol levels and BMI, and all sorts of things were measured. And they then looked to see who went on to develop different conditions. And what that then enables them to say is, oh my goodness, look at the pattern between the people who smoked when we first did that question and the people who went on to develop lung cancer. And that association then should be tested in a randomized trial. So then you say, okay, so we now have a research hypothesis that lung cancer is associated with smoking. Now, what you should do then is to take a randomized controlled trial and say, right, you 100 people are going to smoke and you 100 people are not going to smoke. And we're going to see how many of you smokers go on to develop lung cancer and how many of you non-smokers go on to develop lung cancer. Now, interestingly, they had the opportunity to do that trial, but they never did it because it would actually have been completely unethical, because the ratios that they were seeing in people who smoked developing lung cancer versus people who didn't was so enormous. You talked about this relative risk and this absolute risk. We are talking about tens, if not hundreds of times difference between that particular association. So they don't need to test it in a randomized controlled trial. You can see that is a causal relationship. But what we see in so many nutritional studies, they analyze something and then they say, oh, the people who ate plants were 10% less likely to go on to develop heart disease. I mean, 10% that's the relative risk. It's absolutely nothing. When you get into the detail of the paper and you look at the absolute risk, that 10% might come down to 1 in 1,000 developed this condition versus 1.1 in 1,000 developed this condition. That is a 10% difference, but it's 1 in 1,000 versus 1 in 1,000 to all intents and purposes. And if you presented that to the average person in the street, they say, oh, I'm not worried about that. But they were worried about the headline on the front of the paper that said 10% greater risk of heart disease if you don't eat your whole grains. And that's what epidemiological evidence tends to do. So I looked at both the epidemiological evidence and the trial evidence, the randomized controlled trial evidence for those 2 dietary fat guidelines. And the really unique thing about the PhD was that I looked at it at the time those guidelines were introduced to basically say, if we could go back in time and we were the dietary committee setting those guidelines and we did a proper review of all of the evidence, would we have introduced those guidelines? And the answer was an absolute no. There was no evidence whatsoever that you should restrict total fat or you should restrict saturated fat. There was just no evidence whatsoever. And then I brought it forward up until 2015, 2016, when I completed my PhD and said, is there any more evidence now? And the answer is no. And then you put your own research in context and you look at the other researchers who have looked at it today. And there are 7 teams of researchers that have looked at all-cause mortality, heart disease mortality, and dietary fat interventions, whether it's reducing dietary fat or modifying dietary fat, less saturated fat, more unsaturated fat. And there's only one team that has ever found one thing. And when you examine that more closely, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So essentially, you have no evidence against fat throughout the entirety of history. And people need to understand the consequence of having demonized fat, because it has given us this catastrophically high carbohydrate diet, which I believe, and I'm not alone in believing this, is behind diabetes, the explosions in diabetes and obesity, because we're back to what we were talking about earlier, that people are eating the macronutrient that their body doesn't even need and the macronutrient that the body can't use for basal metabolic needs. We've just got the fat and carbohydrate intake completely the wrong way round.
So what was the rationale behind the guidelines and the reduction in fat? What, I mean, this evidence was obviously available to the groups of people doing the investigation. So what was the rationale?
That's the perfect question. And I think, and people who've looked at this in books, so for example, Nina Teicholz in The Big Fat Surprise, Denise Minger in the Food Pyramid book that she wrote, people who've looked at this point to personal influence. And the guy, Senator George McGovern, who presided over the committee that put together those first dietary fat guidelines had just been on a low-fat boot camp before going along to hear the evidence put in front of the committee. So he was going in with confirmation bias. I think he'd very much enjoyed his low-fat eating. You know, if I went to a low-fat boot camp, I am absolutely sure that I would love it for a week, and being given juices and fresh fruits and salads and quinoa and grains and everything prepared for me. And if I'd come from having, as he was a politician, if I'd come from having quite a bad diet of rich dinners with other senators and businessmen, probably it was at the time, I'm sure I would have felt better for ditching the heavy meals and the breads and the potatoes and the booze and whatever else he was on at the time, and getting away to a nice environment and having food prepared for me over the week. And I'm sure at the end of that I would come back and say, wow, I feel terrific. But I think he then made the mistake of saying, if only the rest of the population ate like this, we would all feel terrific. And there was at least one person working on the dietary guidelines, Nick Motton, who was coming from a personal vegetarian perspective as well. So that influence should not be allowed into the Dietary Guidelines Committee. There's some research being done on the current committee, and apparently 11 out of 20 of the committee members presiding over the guidelines that are about to be published any day now have contacts with an organization called ILSI, the International Life Sciences Institute or whatever. Don't even be fooled by any name. It's the who's who of the fake food industry, from the fizzy drinks to the confectionery manufacturers and every other fake food product in between. And that should not be allowed to happen, because you should have scientists on there who don't come from any confirmation bias, who will genuinely evaluate the evidence with no preconceived ideas and come out and say, this is what the population should be eating. And if you do that, you would not come out with the dietary guidelines that we've had for the last 40 years, because there simply is no evidence that plants or low fat is more nutritious than animal produce and high fat. In fact, the complete opposite. You don't get so many nutrients, the fat soluble nutrients, complete protein, retinol, D3. There are so many nutrients, heme iron, calcium and so on, that are particularly rich in those animal foods that have been demonized for so long.
That's really interesting. I tried to have a look at how our food guidelines, where they came from, and essentially we copied Australia and Australia copied the US, you know.
Yeah.
So like you say, it's affected the whole world.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the work of Belinda Fettke in Australia?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you'll
Yeah.
also appreciate there's not only a sort of food industry agenda behind this. There's very much a religious vegetarian agenda behind this as well. And she's traced some phenomenal roots back to the Seventh-day Adventists and the view that eating flesh in any form is sinful. Massive organizations like Sanitarium, which are essentially grain and cereal companies, have massive influence over the preservation of the grain and cereal guidelines.
And we're very aligned, or we have been very aligned with Australia with the same thing. And our dietitians are all kind of, and our GPs are all sort of aligned with the Sanitarium message.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, I talked to Ted Naiman a couple of weeks ago, and because he grew up as a vegetarian and as a Seventh-day Adventist. So yeah.
I grew up as a veggie, not a Seventh-day Adventist. I didn't know that about Ted. That's interesting.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting conversation.